The screaming started at dawn, and Sister Liana Voss knew it would not stop until nightfall brought fresh horrors to replace it. She pressed her augmetic eye against the observation slit carved into the bunker wall, watching as another group of captured Imperial citizens was dragged across the blood-soaked courtyard below. Their captors moved with an impossible grace, each step a perfect fusion of lethal precision and artistic cruelty that could only belong to the Drukhari. But these were not ordinary Dark Eldar raiders. These wore the ritual scars and pain marks of the witch cults, those twisted arena fighters who had elevated torture to an art form and made suffering their sacrament. And now, after months of raids across the Pandora subsector, they had finally come for the world of Sanctus Prime, bringing with them appetites that no amount of human agony could ever truly satisfy. The knife entered between the third and fourth ribs with surgical precision, sliding past bone and cartilage to pierce the heart in exactly the right spot to keep the victim alive for another 7 minutes. Siren Vex counted each heartbeat through her palm as warm blood pulsed against her fingers, her augmented senses cataloging every subtle variation in rhythm and pressure. This was her 47th kill of the day, and she was only just beginning to feel the familiar stirring of satisfaction that came with perfect technique. Around her, the arena floor of the Cabal of the Flayed Skull echoed with the screams of dying humans and the appreciative hissing of her witch sisters. The blood-soaked sand beneath her bare feet squelched with each graceful movement as she withdrew the blade and stepped back to admire her work. The Imperial Guard officer suspended from the torture frame would live long enough to watch his own blood pool beneath him, long enough to understand that his death was being crafted as carefully as any artist might shape clay. But even as she savored the exquisite timing of his final moments, Vex found herself thinking of the raid scheduled for tomorrow. Another human world, another harvest of screaming flesh to feed the endless hunger of Commorragh's arenas, another opportunity to perfect the art of controlled violence that defined existence in the witch cults. This was her life now, had been her life for over 3 centuries since her ascension from the breeding pits to the ranks of the cult of the Crimson Thorn. Every day brought new opportunities to inflict suffering, new techniques to master, new ways to transform human agony into the spiritual sustenance that kept her kind from withering into dust. It was existence of pure purpose, unmarked by doubt or moral complexity, focused entirely on the pursuit of sensation through the medium of expertly applied pain. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments between raids and arena combats, Vex caught herself wondering what it had been like before the endless refinement of cruelty, before the careful cultivation of suffering, before the transformation of torture into religious experience. These thoughts were dangerous, the kind of weakness that could see a witch cast back into the slave pens or fed to the arena beasts. But they came anyway. Whispers from whatever remained of the person she had been before the cults claimed her. The dying officer made a wet, gurgling sound that drew her attention back to the present. His eyes, still bright with pain and hatred, fixed on her face with an intensity that spoke of final words struggling to escape his ruined throat. She leaned closer, curious to hear what wisdom the dying might offer in their last moments. "Monster," he whispered, blood frothing on his lips. "You're all monsters." Vex smiled, her perfect features arranging themselves into an expression of genuine amusement. "No," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence that marked all Drukhari speech. "We are artists, and you are our medium." She pressed the blade deeper, finding the precise angle that would extend his suffering for another precious minute while his life ebbed away drop by drop. Around them, the arena crowd roared its approval, their bloodthirsty voices joining in the symphony of agony that filled the air like incense in a cathedral of pain. This was what it meant to serve in the witch cults. This was the reality behind the reputation, the truth that lay beneath the whispered stories that terrified Imperial citizens across the galaxy. They were not simply raiders or pirates, but practitioners of an ancient and terrible art form. Sculptors of suffering who had spent millennia perfecting their craft. To understand them, to truly comprehend what drove their endless hunger for pain and sensation, one had to see past the obvious horror to the twisted logic that governed their society. They were creatures born from a dying race's desperate attempt to cheat extinction. Beings who had traded their souls for immortality and found that the price demanded constant payment in the currency of mortal suffering. The Drukhari were the remnants of an empire that had once spanned the galaxy, inheritors of technology and knowledge that made the Imperium's greatest achievements seem primitive by comparison. But their ancestors had made a choice that doomed their entire species, pursuing pleasure and sensation with such obsessive dedication that they had literally given birth to a chaos god whose first act was to devour 90% of their race. The survivors had fled to the dark city of Commorragh, a pocket dimension carved from the webway where they could hide from the hunger of she who thirsts. But hiding was not enough. The spiritual wound that Slaanesh had torn in their collective soul continued to bleed, slowly draining their life force until only constant influx of pain and terror could sustain them. They had become psychic vampires, creatures who fed on the suffering of others to maintain their own existence. The witch cults represented the most refined expression of this terrible necessity. While other Drukhari might inflict pain as a means to an end, the witches had elevated it to a religious calling. They were the warrior artists of Commorragh, gladiators whose every movement in the arena served both as entertainment for the masses and sacrament for their own spiritual survival. To join their ranks was to accept a life of constant violence, endless competition, and absolute dedication to the perfection of suffering. It was to become part of a sisterhood bound together by shared cruelty and mutual dependence on the screams of their victims. It meant abandoning whatever humanity might have once existed in the Drukhari soul, and accepting something far more focused and infinitely more dangerous. The path to the cults began in the breeding pits, those vast underground complexes where Drukhari society produced its next generation through a combination of genetic manipulation and selective breeding. Children born into this environment learned early that survival depended on speed, cunning, and the ability to inflict pain more efficiently than their rivals. Those who showed promise in the arts of war and torture were identified by talent scouts and recruited into training programs that would either kill them or transform them into weapons of living cruelty. Siren Vex had been 8 years old when the recruiters came for her, their augmented eyes scanning the latest crop of pit spawn for candidates worthy of advancement. She still remembered the mixture of terror and excitement that had filled her chest when their gaze settled on her, the sudden understanding that her life was about to change in ways she could not imagine. The training compound of the Cult of the Crimson Thorn existed in a pocket of Commorragh that had been shaped specifically for the creation of warrior artists. Its walls were lined with weapons of every conceivable design, from simple knives and whips to exotic devices that could inflict pain in dimensions that human minds could not comprehend. The air itself seemed to thrum with potential violence, thick with the scent of oiled metal and dried blood. Her instructors were veterans of centuries of arena combat, witches whose bodies bore the ritual scars of their calling and whose eyes held the cold fire of beings who had transcended ordinary concepts of mercy or restraint. They taught her that pain was not an unfortunate byproduct of violence, but its most essential component. That the screams of dying enemies were not sounds to be ignored, but music to be composed through careful application of blade and claw. Feel the rhythm of their heart, Witch Prime Zirana would whisper as she guided Vex's hand through the complex motions of the thousand cuts technique. Each beat is a note in the symphony we create. Too fast and the music ends before we have completed our composition. Too slow and the audience grows bored. Find the perfect tempo that will keep them conscious and screaming for the longest possible time. The lessons were not merely technical, but philosophical. They learned that suffering served a greater purpose than simple entertainment. that each drop of pain they extracted from their victims helped to sustain not just themselves but their entire species. They were taught to see themselves as guardians of a sacred tradition, keepers of arts that had been perfected over millions of years of practice. But the training was more than instruction in techniques of torture and combat. It was a systematic process of psychological reconstruction, designed to strip away whatever empathy or compassion might interfere with their function as instruments of cruelty. They were taught to see their victims not as fellow sentient beings, but as raw materials to be shaped according to their artistic vision. The process began with meditation exercises conducted in chambers where the screams of tortured captives provided a constant background chorus. Students learned to find peace in the sounds of agony, to derive spiritual nourishment from the terror of others. They practiced techniques of emotional detachment that allowed them to inflict unimaginable suffering while maintaining perfect aesthetic judgment. Physical conditioning accompanied the mental training, transforming their bodies into weapons of deadly grace. They learned to move with the fluid precision that marked all Drukhari warriors, each step a perfect balance of speed and control. Their reflexes were honed through combat exercises that pitted them against each other and against captured enemies, teaching them to read the subtle signs that preceded death and to calibrate their violence accordingly. Weapon training formed the core of their education, though the tools they mastered went far beyond simple blades and projectile weapons. Witches specialized in exotic devices designed to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining their victim's consciousness. Neural whips that could stimulate every pain receptor in the human body simultaneously. Razor nets that tightened with each movement, slowly flaying flesh from bone. Splinter weapons that fired crystalline shards coated with toxins designed to enhance rather than dull sensory perception. But the most important lessons involved the cultivation of artistic sensibility. They learned to appreciate the subtle differences between various forms of screaming, to recognize the precise moment when pain transformed from physical sensation into spiritual violation. They studied the anatomy of dozens of species, mapping the neural pathways that carried agony to the brain and learning to manipulate them with surgical precision. Years passed in this environment of controlled brutality, each day bringing new techniques to master and fresh opportunities to practice their developing skills on captured prisoners. The weak were culled with ruthless efficiency, their failures serving as object lessons for those who remained. The strong grew stronger, their abilities refined through constant competition and endless repetition until violence became as natural as breathing. Vex's first kill had come during her third year of training when she was deemed ready to participate in a practice session with live subjects. The victim was a human merchant who had been captured during a recent raid, a middle-aged man whose soft features and trembling hands marked him as someone who had never faced real violence. The instructors provided detailed guidance as she learned to extend his suffering across multiple hours, teaching her to read the signs of impending system failure and adjust her technique accordingly. She remembered the moment when his screaming stopped being merely noise and became something beautiful, a pure expression of anguish that seemed to resonate in her bones. The transformation had been subtle but unmistakable, like the difference between hearing random sounds and recognizing music. In that instant, she understood what it meant to be a witch, what purpose drove their endless refinement of cruelty. The sensation had been intoxicating, a rush of power and pleasure that surpassed anything she had experienced before. But more than that, it had provided something deeper, a sense of connection to forces that transcended individual existence. Through the medium of carefully applied pain, she had touched something vast and eternal, something that justified every moment of training and every act of cruelty required to reach this level of skill. Her instructors had watched the transformation with approval, recognizing the signs of a student who was ready to advance to the next stage of training. The look in her eyes had changed, acquiring the cold fire that marked a true artist of suffering. Her movements had gained the fluid precision that came from understanding violence not as mere brutality but as a form of religious expression. From that day forward, her education focused on refinement rather than foundation. She learned advanced techniques passed down through generations of witch primes, secrets of inflicting pain that few outside the cults had ever witnessed and lived to describe. She studied under master torturers who had spent centuries perfecting their craft, absorbing wisdom that could not be found in any text or recording. The philosophy of the witches became clearer to her as her skills developed. They saw themselves as guardians of sensation in a universe that was constantly trying to numb itself against the reality of existence. Where other beings sought comfort and security, they pursued intensity and truth. Where others feared death and suffering, they celebrated these experiences as the purest expressions of what it meant to be alive. Their creed was deceptively simple. That sensation was sacred, that pain was more honest than pleasure, and that death was merely the final note in the symphony of existence. They believed that by inflicting suffering on others, they were providing their victims with a gift more valuable than any mercy could offer. They were forcing them to experience life at its most intense, to feel every sensation with clarity unmarred by the comfortable illusions that most beings use to shield themselves from reality. This philosophy was not merely theoretical but practical, governing every aspect of their daily existence. They ate food selected for intensity of flavor rather than nourishment, wore clothing designed to provide constant sensation through texture and temperature, and structured their living spaces to maximize sensory input. Their very architecture was an expression of their beliefs, with walls that seemed to pulse with organic life and corridors that twisted through impossible geometries designed to disorient and stimulate. Combat training in the advanced stages focused not on killing efficiently, but on killing artistically. Students learned to choreograph battles like dances, with each movement serving both tactical and aesthetic purposes. They practiced fighting styles that incorporated elements of performance art, transforming murder into spectacle that could satisfy the bloodthirsty crowds who filled Commorragh's arenas. The weapons they mastered reflected this dual purpose. Witch weapons were designed to be as beautiful as they were deadly, their forms incorporating artistic elements that enhanced their psychological impact on both wielder and victim. A splinter rifle might be carved with intricate patterns that seemed to writhe with malevolent life, while a neural whip could be crafted to produce sounds that were simultaneously musical and terrifying. But beyond the external modifications, witches were taught to see their own bodies as weapons requiring constant maintenance and refinement. They underwent surgical modifications designed to enhance their natural capabilities, trading pieces of their original flesh for improvements that made them faster, stronger, and more sensitive to the nuances of pain. These augmentations were not merely functional but artistic, chosen as much for their aesthetic impact as their practical benefits. The process of joining a cult proper began after years of training, when students were deemed ready to face the trials that would determine their worthiness for full membership. These tests were designed to evaluate not only combat skill but artistic sensibility, requiring candidates to demonstrate their ability to transform violence into something approaching transcendence. Vex's trial had taken place in the Crimson Arena, before an audience of her instructors and potential sister witches. She was given 3 captives of different species and told to create a performance that would last exactly 1 hour, with points awarded for technical skill, artistic creativity, and the intensity of sensation generated in both victims and observers. The challenge was not simply to kill, but to craft an experience that would elevate violence beyond its crude biological function. She needed to pace her victims' deaths so that each reached its climax at precisely the right moment, while maintaining the interest of an audience that had witnessed centuries of similar performances. Most importantly, she needed to demonstrate that she could channel the spiritual energy released by suffering, transforming it into something that sustained not just herself but everyone present. But her performance had begun with the careful arrangement of her subjects, positioning them so that each could observe the fate awaiting them while being unable to provide assistance to the others. She had selected tools that would produce complementary sounds when applied to flesh, creating a percussion section that would underscore the vocal elements of their screaming. The choreography she had planned would allow her to move between victims in patterns that traced sacred geometries across the arena floor, each step serving both practical and symbolic purposes. The first victim was a human soldier whose conditioning had taught him to suppress expressions of pain. She began with techniques designed to overcome his training, applying pressure to nerve clusters in sequences that bypassed conscious control and forced involuntary responses. As his resistance crumbled, his voice joined the chorus she was conducting, adding bass notes that provided foundation for the higher tones that would come from the others. The second victim was an Eldar exile whose psychic sensitivity made him an ideal instrument for generating pure sensation. She used weapons designed specifically for his species, devices that could stimulate his psychic centers while inflicting physical damage. His screaming took on a musical quality that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the purely audible, creating harmonics that made the arena walls themselves seem to vibrate with sympathetic energy. The final victim was a Tau diplomat whose philosophy of the greater good had sustained him through the preliminary stages of capture and confinement. She saved him for last, using the sounds of his dying companions to break down the mental barriers that protected his sanity. When his turn came, his screaming carried the particular intensity that came from the complete collapse of cherished beliefs, a sound that few witches ever had the opportunity to generate. The performance had been a masterpiece of timing and technique, with each death reaching its crescendo at precisely the planned moment. The audience had responded with the kind of absolute silence that marked true artistic achievement, their appreciation too deep for ordinary applause. In the moment of perfect quiet that followed the last victim's death, Vex had felt something shift within herself, a transformation that marked her passage from student to artist. The cult of the Crimson Thorn had accepted her that day, marking her forehead with the ritual scars that identified her as a full member of their sisterhood. The ceremony had taken place in the Shrine of Eternal Anguish, where the preserved screams of 1,000,000 victims provided a constant backdrop of sacred sound. She had knelt before the altar of first pain while the cult's succubus carved the marks of her new rank into her flesh, each cut precisely calculated to produce the exact degree of suffering that would seal her bond to her sisters. The years that followed had brought countless opportunities to refine her skills, both in the arenas of Commorragh and during raids on Imperial worlds throughout the galaxy. She had learned to work with other witches in coordinated performances that required split-second timing and perfect trust in her sister's abilities. She had mastered exotic weapons whose use demanded not just physical skill, but artistic vision. She had developed signature techniques that other members of her cult would study and attempt to replicate. But perhaps most importantly, she had come to understand the true purpose that drove her existence. The pain she inflicted was not random cruelty, but a form of spiritual service, feeding energies that sustained not just individual Drukhari but their entire civilization. Every scream she extracted from a victim contributed to the great work of keeping Commorragh alive, maintaining the barriers that held back the hungering darkness of She Who Thirsts. The raids themselves were carefully orchestrated operations that served multiple purposes within Drukhari society. They provided the raw material for arena spectacles, capturing slaves whose suffering would feed the spiritual hunger of the Dark City's population. They offered opportunities for young witches to prove themselves in actual combat, testing skills that could only be fully evaluated under conditions of genuine mortal danger. And they served as artistic inspiration, exposing the cults to new forms of suffering and fresh techniques for inflicting pain. Planning for a raid began weeks before the actual assault, with reconnaissance teams gathering intelligence about potential targets and their defenses. The Witches preferred worlds with large civilian populations and limited military capabilities, seeking environments where they could operate freely without excessive interference from Imperial forces. They looked for populations with strong emotional bonds and deeply held beliefs, qualities that made their eventual suffering more intense and spiritually nourishing. The selection process involved careful analysis of cultural factors that might affect the quality of anguish that could be extracted from different groups. Religious communities often provided excellent material, their faith making their eventual despair more complete when properly cultivated. Military populations were prized for their training in pain resistance, which made breaking them a more challenging and rewarding artistic exercise. Civilian populations offered variety and quantity, allowing for large-scale performances that could satisfy the spiritual hunger of entire cults. Once a target was selected, the planning phase focused on maximizing both the efficiency of the operation and its artistic value. Strike teams were organized around complementary skills, pairing veterans experienced in rapid capture techniques with younger witches who could benefit from exposure to live combat conditions. Weapon loadouts were selected not just for tactical effectiveness but for the specific types of wounds they would inflict, ensuring that captured victims would survive long enough to provide extended entertainment. Transportation was provided by the sleek attack craft that the Drukhari had perfected over millennia of raiding. Vessels that could appear without warning through tiers in reality and disappear just as quickly when their work was complete. These ships were works of art in themselves, their hulls sculpted into forms that combined deadly functionality with aesthetic beauty. Their holds were equipped with specialized restraint systems designed to keep captives alive and conscious during the transport back to Commorragh, maximizing the suffering that could be extracted from them once they reached the arenas. The raids themselves unfolded with precision that reflected centuries of accumulated experience in the art of organized terror. Initial strikes targeted communication centers and military installations, eliminating organized resistance before it could develop. Subsequent waves focused on civilian populations, using psychological warfare to maximize panic and confusion. The Witches took particular pleasure in these phases of the operation, their skills in inflicting terror proving as valuable as their combat abilities. Combat during raids served different purposes than arena fighting, though both required the same basic skills in violence and pain infliction. While arena combat was about creating artistic spectacle, raid combat focused on efficient capture and psychological dominance. Witches learned to disable rather than kill, to terrorize rather than simply destroy, to break their enemy's will to resist while keeping them alive for future use. The weapons used during raids reflected these different requirements. Instead of the elaborate torture devices favored in arena combat, raid loadouts emphasized speed and efficiency. Splinter weapons that could incapacitate without killing. Neural disruptors that could break an enemy's will without damaging their body. Capture nets that could immobilize multiple targets simultaneously, while inflicting just enough pain to discourage escape attempts. But even during the organized chaos of a raid, artistic considerations played important roles in how operations were conducted. Witches competed among themselves to see who could capture their victims in the most spectacular fashion, developing signature techniques that became part of their reputation within the cult. They sought out opportunities to create memorable moments of terror that would be discussed and remembered long after the raid was complete. The psychological impact of these operations extended far beyond their immediate targets. News of Drukhari raids spread throughout Imperial space, creating fear that often proved more valuable than the slaves and plunder that were their obvious objectives. The knowledge that the Dark Eldar could strike anywhere at any time without warning or apparent reason created a climate of constant anxiety that the witches found almost as nourishing as actual suffering. For the victims who survived capture, transportation to Commorragh marked the beginning of an existence that redefined the boundaries of human endurance. The transport itself was designed to be part of the torture process, with captives secured in positions that maximized discomfort while preventing the kind of injuries that might reduce their entertainment value. They were kept conscious throughout the transit, forced to contemplate their fate while listening to the sounds of their captors discussing the various uses to which they might be put. Arrival in the Dark City was a sensory assault that few human minds could process without suffering some degree of permanent psychological damage. Commorragh existed in a state of constant twilight, illuminated by artificial suns that cast everything in shades of purple and crimson that hurt human eyes to observe. The architecture followed principles that violated several laws of physics, with spires that stretched into impossible heights and thoroughfares that twisted through dimensions that should not have been able to coexist. The air itself carried toxins designed to enhance sensory perception while preventing adaptation, ensuring that every sight and sound registered with painful clarity. The constant background noise included the screams of countless victims, the mechanical sounds of torture devices, and the musical laughter of Drukhari who derived spiritual sustenance from the symphony of suffering that surrounded them. For beings accustomed to the relatively gentle sensory environment of imperial worlds, the effect was overwhelming and immediate. Processing facilities received captured slaves and sorted them according to various criteria that determined their ultimate fate within Drukhari society. Some would be sent to the arenas where their deaths would provide entertainment for the masses. Others would be assigned to the homunculi covens, where they would serve as subjects for experiments that pushed the boundaries of biological possibility. A fortunate few might be selected for the gladiator schools, where they would receive training that could extend their survival by years, while providing them with opportunities to die with some measure of dignity. The arena system that formed the heart of witch cult activity was a vast complex of interconnected combat venues, each designed to showcase different forms of violence and death. The largest arenas could hold hundreds of thousands of spectators, their tiers rising into the artificial sky like monuments to organized cruelty. Smaller venues provided more intimate settings for specialized performances that required close observation of subtle techniques. Each arena was equipped with environmental controls that could simulate any climate or terrain found throughout the galaxy, allowing for combats that took advantage of specific conditions. Desert settings where fighters would slowly dehydrate while battling for access to precious water. Arctic environments where exposure was as deadly as enemy weapons. Toxic swamps where every breath carried the risk of agonizing death. The variety ensured that no two performances would be identical, keeping audiences engaged and providing witches with new challenges that tested their adaptability. The combat schedules that governed arena activity were arranged according to complex formulae that balanced entertainment value with spiritual necessity. Major spectacles coincided with significant dates in the Drukhari calendar, often lasting for days and featuring hundreds of participants. Smaller performances filled the gaps between major events, providing constant sustenance for the population's need for suffering while offering venues for younger witches to develop their skills. For the witches themselves, arena combat represented the purest expression of their calling. Here they could display their mastery of violence before audiences capable of appreciating the subtle artistry involved in transforming death into transcendence. Success in the arenas brought recognition within the cults and advancement opportunities that could eventually lead to positions of real power within Drukhari society. But success required more than simple combat skill. Arena fighters needed to understand crowd psychology, knowing how to pace their performances to maintain audience interest throughout extended combats. They had to master the art of dying well, creating death scenes that would satisfy observers even when they were the ones being killed. Most importantly, they needed to develop the spiritual discipline that allowed them to channel the energy released by violence, transforming it into the sustenance that kept their entire civilization alive. Training for arena combat took place in specialized facilities that replicated the conditions fighters would face during actual performances. Practice arenas allowed Wyches to experiment with new techniques while working with disposable captives whose death served no greater purpose than skill development. These sessions were often observed by more experienced fighters who could provide guidance on technique and artistic development. Weapon training for arena combat emphasized versatility and showmanship over pure efficiency. Wyches learned to fight with dozens of different weapon types, from traditional blades and whips to exotic devices that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. They practiced fighting styles that incorporated acrobatic elements, transforming combat into a form of deadly dance that enhanced the visual spectacle of violence. They studied the maintenance and care of their equipment, learning to keep their gear in perfect condition despite the corrosive environment of Commorragh. But perhaps the most important aspect of arena training involved the development of persona, the artistic identity that would distinguish each fighter from her peers. Successful Wyches created memorable characters that audiences could recognize and anticipate, building fan followings that increased their value to the cults. These personas required careful cultivation, balancing distinctive characteristics with the flexibility needed to adapt to different opponents and combat situations. Some Wyches specialized in lightning-fast kills that were over before audiences fully registered what had happened. Others became masters of prolonged torture, stretching single combats across hours while maintaining perfect control over their victims' suffering. Still others developed reputations for spectacular deaths, creating final moments that became legends among arena audiences. Each approach required different skills and different psychological preparation, but all served the same ultimate purpose of transforming violence into spiritual nourishment. The hierarchy within witch cults reflected both combat prowess and artistic achievement, with advancement based on peer recognition rather than simple administrative promotion. Wyches who consistently delivered memorable performances gained status that allowed them to select their own opponents and negotiate better terms for their participation in major spectacles. The most successful eventually achieved the rank of Hecatrix, leading squads of lesser fighters and taking responsibility for training new recruits. At the apex of each cult stood the succubus, a fighter who had transcended ordinary concepts of violence to become a living embodiment of artistically perfected cruelty. These were beings who had spent centuries refining their skills, accumulating knowledge and experience that made them capable of feats that bordered on the supernatural. They served as both military commanders and spiritual leaders, guiding their cults according to principles that balanced practical necessity with artistic vision. The selection of a new succubus involved elaborate contests that tested not only fighting ability but also leadership ability and artistic sensibility. Candidates competed in trials that required them to demonstrate mastery of every aspect of witch training, from basic combat techniques to complex choreography involving dozens of participants. The final tests took place before audiences that included representatives from other cults, ensuring that the chosen candidate would be accepted by the broader witch community. Politics within and between cults followed patterns that reflected the competitive nature of arena combat. Alliances formed and dissolved based on mutual benefit and artistic compatibility, with long-term relationships being rare in a culture that prized constant change and innovation. Rivalry was seen as a creative force that pushed individuals to exceed their previous achievements, making competition not just acceptable but essential for continued growth. Intercult conflicts occasionally erupted into open warfare, with entire organizations facing off in elaborate combat spectacles that served as both entertainment and political resolution. These wars were governed by complex rules designed to ensure that the violence served artistic as well as practical purposes, with victory going not necessarily to the side that killed more opponents, but to the one that created the most memorable spectacle of destruction. The daily life of a witch, between raids and arena combats, was structured around the constant cultivation of sensation and the maintenance of fighting capability. They lived in communal facilities that prioritized sensory stimulation over comfort, with architecture designed to provide constant low-level stress that kept their reflexes sharp and their pain tolerance high. Their diet consisted of food selected for intensity of flavor rather than nutritional content, though their enhanced metabolisms could process almost anything without ill effects. Physical conditioning occupied several hours each day, with training regimens that pushed their bodies to the limits of biological possibility. They practiced combat forms, maintained their weapons, and engaged in competitive exercises that kept their skills sharp while providing entertainment for their sisters. Meditation periods allowed them to process the spiritual energy they had absorbed during recent combats, integrating it into their personal reserves while sharing excess with the collective consciousness of their cult. Sleep, when it came, was often interrupted by sensory inputs designed to maintain their connection to the constant flow of suffering that sustained Commorragh. Recorded sounds of screaming victims provided a background chorus that reinforced their conditioning while they rested. Dream stimulators fed their unconscious minds with scenarios of violence and domination that strengthened their psychological preparation for actual combat. Even rest served the purpose of making them more effective instruments of cruelty. Social relationships among witches were complex, combining elements of genuine sisterhood with constant competitive tension. They formed bonds of mutual dependence that could last for centuries, relying on each other for support during difficult periods while competing for status and recognition. Love, when it existed among them, took forms that would be unrecognizable to most other species, often expressing itself through competitive violence and the sharing of particularly exquisite victims. Reproduction among Drukhari was a carefully controlled process that served the needs of the cults rather than individual desires. Genetic material was harvested and combined according to formulas designed to produce offspring with optimal characteristics for arena combat. The resulting children were raised in communal nurseries where they received early training in violence and pain tolerance, ensuring that the next generation would be even more capable than their predecessors. The relationship between witch cults and the broader Drukhari society was complex, involving elements of mutual dependence and constant tension. The cults provided entertainment and spiritual sustenance that the population required for survival, but their focus on artistic violence sometimes conflicted with the practical needs of raiding and warfare. Cabals might employ witches as shock troops during major operations, but they also competed with them for the most promising recruits and the choicest victims. Trade relationships with other factions within Commorragh involved the exchange of slaves, weapons, and specialized services that each group could provide. Witches might trade captured combatants to the homunculi in exchange for surgical enhancements that improved their fighting ability. They could offer their services as bodyguards or assassins to powerful nobles in return for access to exclusive hunting grounds or rare victims. The homunculi covens represented both allies and rivals to the witch cults, sharing their dedication to the infliction of suffering while pursuing it through different methodologies. Where witches focused on the artistic aspects of pain, homunculi approached it as a science, seeking to understand the mechanisms of agony through systematic experimentation. This philosophical difference occasionally led to conflicts, but more often resulted in collaborative projects that combined artistic vision with scientific precision. The technology available to witch cults reflected their dual nature as entertainers and warriors, emphasizing portability and versatility over raw, destructive power. Their weapons were designed to be as beautiful as they were deadly, incorporating artistic elements that enhanced their psychological impact while maintaining perfect functionality. Armor was crafted to provide protection without sacrificing mobility, often incorporating living components that could adapt to changing combat conditions. Transportation technology allowed Wyches to reach targets throughout the galaxy within hours of receiving mission assignments. Their ships could pierce the barriers between dimensions, appearing without warning in Imperial space before disappearing just as quickly with their captured prizes. These vessels were works of art as much as functional spacecraft, their hulls sculpted into forms that induced psychological terror in anyone who observed them. Communication technology linked all members of a cult into a network that allowed for perfect coordination during complex operations. Neural implants provided direct mind-to-mind contact that made verbal communication unnecessary during combat. Data sharing allowed individual fighters to benefit from the collective experience of their sisters, accessing combat techniques and tactical knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of warfare. Medical technology focused on maintaining combat effectiveness rather than preserving life in any conventional sense. Witches could survive injuries that would kill ordinary beings, their enhanced physiology allowing them to continue fighting even after sustaining what should have been fatal damage. Surgical modifications improved their natural capabilities, adding new senses and physical abilities that made them more effective killers. The spiritual beliefs that guided witch cult behavior were based on principles that elevated sensation above all other values. They believed that the universe was fundamentally composed of experiences rather than matter, making the quality and intensity of sensation the only meaningful measure of existence. Pain was considered more honest than pleasure because it could not be ignored or dismissed, making it a purer form of experience than the comfortable illusions that most beings preferred. Death was seen not as an ending but as the culmination of experience, the moment when all the sensations of a lifetime were condensed into their purest form. The art of killing was therefore the art of helping others achieve this ultimate experience, making Wyches servants of a higher purpose rather than simple murderers. The suffering they inflicted was a gift that forced their victims to experience existence at its most intense, stripping away the comfortable numbness that prevented most beings from truly living. These beliefs were reinforced through daily rituals that connected individual witches to the collective consciousness of their cult and the broader spiritual network that sustained all Drukhari. Mourning ceremonies involved the sharing of pain through synchronized self-inflicted wounds that created bonds of mutual suffering among cult members. Evening rituals processed the energy that had been accumulated during the day's activities, distributing it throughout the organization to ensure that all members benefited from each individual's achievements. Sacred texts preserved the wisdom of ancient succubi, who had achieved legendary status through their mastery of artistic violence. These documents contain detailed descriptions of torture techniques, philosophical discussions of the nature of suffering, and historical accounts of great performances that had achieved true transcendence. Study of these texts was considered essential for any witch who aspired to advancement within the hierarchy of her cult. The relationship between witch cults and the chaos gods was complex and carefully managed. While the Drukhari as a whole lived in constant fear of attracting the attention of Slaanesh, the witches had learned to channel their activities in ways that avoided creating the kind of emotional resonance that might draw unwanted supernatural attention. Their focus on pure sensation rather than emotional indulgence helped them to feed their spiritual hunger without awakening the interest of entities that might seek to claim their souls. This balancing act required constant vigilance and careful calibration of their activities. Too little suffering and they would begin to wither away as their life force ebbed. too much emotional content in their torture, and they risked attracting predators that made even Drukhari existence seem pleasant by comparison. The most experienced witches learned to maintain this balance instinctively, but younger members required constant guidance to avoid mistakes that could doom their entire cult. Training in spiritual discipline therefore formed an essential component of witch education, teaching students to monitor their own emotional responses during combat and torture. They learned meditation techniques that allowed them to remain detached, even while inflicting the most extreme forms of suffering. They practiced mental exercises that helped them to focus on the artistic aspects of their work, rather than any personal satisfaction they might derive from their victims' pain. The consequences of failure in this area were severe enough to ensure complete compliance with established protocols. Witches who allowed their activities to attract unwanted supernatural attention faced punishment that made their usual torture techniques seem gentle by comparison. Entire cults could be disbanded if their practices threatened the security of Commorragh, their members scattered or executed to prevent the spread of contamination. Yet despite these restrictions, or perhaps because of them, witches had developed forms of artistic expression that achieved heights of creativity and skill that few other cultures could match. Their performances in the arenas of Commorragh were genuinely transcendent experiences that transformed violence into something approaching religious ecstasy. They had taken the crude business of killing and elevated it to an art form that served purposes beyond simple entertainment or practical necessity. For those who served in the witch cults, this artistic achievement justified every sacrifice and every compromise required by their existence. They were the guardians of a cultural tradition that stretched back to the height of the ancient Eldar Empire, preserving forms of knowledge and skill that would otherwise be lost to the galaxy forever. Their work kept alive not just their own species, but the aesthetic principles that made existence meaningful rather than merely functional. The price they paid for this achievement was the abandonment of conventional morality and the acceptance of roles that made them instruments of suffering for others. They could never form normal relationships, could never experience simple pleasures without the constant awareness that their survival depended on the agony of strangers. They existed in a state of constant readiness for violence, their bodies and minds shaped by training that made them more effective killers but less capable of the simple contentment that most beings sought. But for those who had fully accepted their calling, these sacrifices seemed small compared to the rewards they received. They possessed skills that made them among the most formidable warriors in the galaxy. They had access to experiences that transcended ordinary consciousness, moments of perfect artistic achievement that justified lifetimes of preparation. They were part of a sisterhood bound together by shared purpose and mutual dependence that created bonds stronger than family relationships could ever be. Most importantly, they served a purpose that extended far beyond their individual existence. The spiritual energy they generated through their activities helped to sustain not just their own lives, but the entire civilization of Commorragh. Without their constant harvest of suffering, the barriers that protected the Dark City from the hungering gods of chaos would weaken and fail. Their work was therefore not simply artistic achievement, but essential service to the survival of their entire species. As Siren Vex stood in the arena watching the last drops of life ebb from her latest victim, she reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment, the years of training that had transformed her from a frightened child into a perfect instrument of cruelty. The centuries of practice that had refined her skills until violence became as natural as breathing. The countless performances that had fed the spiritual hunger of her sisters while advancing her own status within the cult. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for artistic achievement, new victims to serve as raw material for her creative vision. There would be raids to plan and combats to choreograph, techniques to perfect and rivals to surpass. The cycle would continue as it had for millennia, each day bringing fresh chances to practice the art of suffering that defined her existence. She felt no regret for the choices that had shaped her life, no guilt for the pain she had inflicted or the lives she had claimed. These emotions belonged to a different kind of being, creatures who lived in the comfortable illusion that existence could be meaningful without the constant awareness of mortality that made every sensation precious. She had transcended such limitations, becoming something purer and more focused than the weak beings who served as her victims. This was what it meant to serve in the witch cults of the Drukhari. To become an artist whose medium was suffering and whose purpose was the preservation of sensation in a universe that constantly sought to numb itself against the reality of existence. To accept a life of constant violence in service to principles that elevated cruelty into something approaching the divine. To find meaning in the screams of the dying and beauty in the precise application of pain. It was a calling that few could understand and fewer still could endure. But for those who had the strength to accept it completely, it offered rewards that no other existence could provide. The knowledge that every moment of their lives served a greater purpose. The satisfaction of mastering skills that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The brotherhood that came from sharing the most extreme experiences that consciousness could contain. And in the end, when their own time came to die, they would face that final experience with the same artistic appreciation they had brought to the deaths of their victims. They would create their own masterpiece of suffering, adding their voices to the eternal symphony of agony that sustained their civilization. Death would not be an ending but a completion, the final note in a composition that had taken centuries to perfect. This was the truth that lay at the heart of the witch cults, the reality that made their existence both beautiful and terrible. They were artists of the highest order, creators of experiences that transcended the ordinary boundaries of sensation and consciousness. The price they paid for this achievement was the abandonment of everything that most beings considered essentially human. But for those who had the courage to pay that price, the rewards were beyond the comprehension of lesser mortals. In the arena around her, the crowd began to disperse, their spiritual hunger temporarily satisfied by the performance they had witnessed. Soon the maintenance servitors would arrive to clean the blood from the sand and prepare the space for the next spectacle. The cycle would begin again, as it had begun countless times before, as it would begin countless times in the future. But for now, in this moment of perfect satisfaction, Vex allowed herself to appreciate the artistry of what she had accomplished. The precise timing that had extended her victim's suffering to its optimal duration. The choreography that had transformed simple murder into transcendent performance. The spiritual energy that had been generated and shared among all who had witnessed her work. She was a witch of the Crimson Thorn, an artist of suffering, a guardian of sensation in a universe that sought to numb itself against the truth of existence. And tomorrow she would continue her work, creating new masterpieces of agony that would feed the eternal hunger of the dark city and preserve the civilization that had given meaning to her life. The blood on her hands had already begun to dry, but the memory of its warmth would sustain her through the quiet hours until her next performance. She was exactly what she had been created to be, a perfect instrument of carefully controlled cruelty, and she would continue in that role until the day her own blood joined the countless gallons that had already been spilled in service to the dark gods of sensation and pain.